fellow peanuts, and welcome to anyone who is new to this channel or to the podcast. Now, this podcast covers true crime cases that may not be suitable for young listeners. There may be graphic and violent content, so listener and viewer discretion is advised. So today, guys, I'm doing a little bit of something for my mum. So hi, mum. This episode is just for her. My mum is easily the most amazing lady. She's my biggest supporter. So I wanted to thank her, and I wanted to make sure that I did a podcast just for her. So here we are, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to be doing an episode on Aileen Wuornos. Now, Mum mentioned to me that I don't often talk about lady serial killers or female serial killers. Now, everybody knows who Aileen is, and I do love to do a bit of research into a serial killer. So this one was actually kind of interesting. Whilst I may focus on some of her early childhood trauma and the victims specifically, I'll still give lots of my own opinions and my thoughts as well. But let's start at the beginning like we always do. But before we even start this, guys, Aileen was a really, really complex character. Obviously, we've got movies like Monster with Charlize Theron. I think there was a made-for-TV movie that was also done. Heaps of documentaries, so everybody is very aware of who Aileen Wernos is. I always sit in the middle of this one where I think it's a really, really tragic story because of who she was and what she went through in her childhood, which we're going to get to, and all that kind of stuff. But it was a really, really hard read, and also all the documentaries that I've watched, especially where she felt like she was traumatized by all of the things that she had to talk about and everything that she went through and had to talk about. So I think it's really, really interesting if you guys get to go and watch a couple of documentaries on her. She's a really intriguing character. So I use that word character because I felt like she played up a little bit with some of her things, but I also think she had some genuine trauma. We're also going to see the other side of these victims, right? So I talk about how sex workers are often the targets of serial killers, and Aileen was a sex worker herself. So we're going to see it from the flip side, but you get to hear about some pretty not so great experiences that she had as well. But look, I love this. I want to say thank you to my mum for being my biggest supporter on my podcast. She's probably the first one to watch all of my podcasts. There are two other people that I will be asking who are also my biggest supporters on this podcast, but you'll get to find out more about them. But we're not deviating so much. We're just going to be talking about a female serial killer. I have already done Florida, obviously as a state, Danny Rowlands, but we will be talking about Florida specifically. Now, before she became one of the most infamous serial killers, she was a child. She was abandoned, she was abused, and she was often forgotten. And before she ever even pulled a trigger, there were 7 men, each with a life and a story, and people who genuinely loved them. So we'll be talking about them too. Now, Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on the 29th of February in 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. Her mother, Diane, was only 16 years old, and her father, who was Leo Pittman, she actually never met him. He would be a convicted sex offender. So he would later die in prison. But I think this was probably where the trauma perhaps started with Aileen, the abandonment issues and all those concerns. So by the age of 4, her and her brother Keith were abandoned by their mother, and they're actually taken in by their grandparents, which was Laurie and Britta Wernos. This really wasn't much of a rescue situation though. This is a relocation into just another cycle of trauma for her. Apparently and allegedly, Laurie was a violent alcoholic who physically and sexually abused his granddaughter. And she grew up in a house where love was conditional and punishment was often routine. So at the age of 11 years old, she began exchanging sexual favors for food, for cigarettes, and for shelter. So not out of rebellion, but really out of necessity. She didn't want to go back to her grandparents' home. She was really a child surviving in a world that had already failed her by the age of 11. At 14, she became pregnant after being raped, and reportedly this was by a family friend. The baby was actually placed up for adoption, and soon after, her grandfather actually kicked her out of the house. So they would force her to live in the woods near her hometown. Now, she survived by continuing sex work, often hitchhiking, but she would often be sleeping outdoors. She's still a teenager at this stage, guys. She's not even like 15. So she's alone, she's homeless, and she's had massive amounts of trauma in her small amounts of life. Her school life was really chaotic. She was frequently truant. By the time that she had dropped out, she had no qualifications. She's got no support system, and there's not really a great future in sight for her. Her only consistent relationship was with her brother Keith. He would eventually, unfortunately, die in 1976 of cancer, but we're going to come back to that because his death actually really devastated her. So her early life is a storm of neglect, it's abuse, it's abandonment. She's never received therapy, obviously, at that time and age. She never had a really stable home, and she never had a chance to properly heal from all of those wounds. Experts later would actually testify, though, that she suffered from borderline personality disorder and PTSD, which are often conditions that are rooted in some really early childhood trauma. Now, this podcast, it's not about excusing what she did later in life. It's more about the understanding, because behind every headline, there is potentially a lot of tragedy and a lot of pain. But by the time she turned 18, her life was already marked by trauma. She's barely surviving in society, but the years that followed would actually spiral her much deeper into instability, violence, and desperation. So in May 1974, she's arrested in Colorado for driving under the influence, disorderly conduct, and firing a .22 caliber pistol from a moving vehicle. This is her first known arrest and a sign of the volatility that's going to continue on through her adult life. She would actually not appear in court, and that would add another charge to her record. In 1976, she hitchhiked her way to Florida, where she would meet someone by the name of Louis Fell, a 69-year-old yacht club president. They married really quickly, and their union was even announced in some society pages. But their relationship was very short-lived and very violent. She was frequently involved in bar fights and was actually briefly in jail for assault. She would even apparently hit her husband, Lewis, with his own cane, prompting him to actually file a restraining order. Within 9 weeks, the marriage was annulled. She's returning to Michigan, where her behaviour is continuing to escalate. So in July 1976, she's arrested again for assault and disturbing the peace after throwing a cue ball at a bartender's head. Just days later, her brother Keith would actually die of cancer. She would receive $100,000, $10,000 from his life insurance policy. She used the money to pay her fines, splurge on some luxuries, including a new car. Unfortunately, she would wreck that some short time later. And by the end of August, the money's all gone. Her emotional state's really deteriorating at this stage because between the ages of 14 and 24, she would attempt suicide 6 times. And in 1978, at the tender age of 22, she shot herself in the stomach in a failed attempt to actually end her own life. Her criminal record's only continuing to grow. In 1981, she's arrested for armed robbery in Edgewater, Florida, stealing $35 and 2 packs of cigarettes from a convenience store, and she's sentenced to prison in 1982 and released in 1983. It's not here, though, where the arrests stop. In 1984, she's caught trying to pass forged checks in Key West. In 1981, she's named as a suspect in a theft of a revolver and ammunition. Just 1 second, guys. Charlotte, come here. Up you get, babes. Come on, sit down. Sorry, guys. So here is my little Charlotte. So in 1986, she's arrested in Miami for car theft, resisting arrest, and obstruction of justice. She would use her aunt's name as false ID. Police would find a .38 caliber revolver and ammunition in the stolen car. Later that year, she's detained after a man accused her of pulling a gun and demanding $200. So the police found a .22 pistol underneath the seat that she had been actually sitting in. In the midst of all of this chaos, though, this is where she meets her girlfriend, Tyria Moore. She's a 24-year-old motel maid, and she met her at a bar in Daytona Beach called Zodiac. They moved in together, and Eileen would support them through all of her sex work. Their relationship was considered quite intense and, even by her own words, deeply emotional. It was love beyond imaginable. Earthly words cannot describe how I felt about Tyria. She would say that. Even before her execution, she would claim that she was still actually in love with her, even though she had been testified against her and had been her downfall. Their relationship, certainly not without any type of incidents, though. They were both detained for assault and battery with a beer bottle. In 1988, Eileen accused a bus driver of assault, claiming he pushed her off the bus. It was there that her girlfriend Tyria was listed as a witness. It's these years that, after a whirlwind of violence, heartbreak, and survival, that she's not really just a woman on the edge. She's a woman that's never really known stability, safety, and love without any type of pain. So her descent into this crime, sort of serial killer crime spree, it's not sudden. It's very slow and it's very unraveling, and it's shaped, I think, heavily by trauma and desperation. By the late 90s, she's just surviving. Her relationship with Tyria has become a little bit more of an emotional anchor for her. She supported them through her prostitution and sex work. In 1989, though, December 1989, everything's changed. This is where she commits her first murder, and this is where we're going to start seeing a beginning of a really deadly pattern. Her first known victim was known as Richard Mallory. He's a 51-year-old electronics store owner from Clearwater in Florida. He picked up Eileen where she was nearby hitchhiking. Now, according to Eileen, he assaulted her and she shot him in self-defense. But the evidence and the murders that followed certainly, it tells a different story, right? It's not that I don't believe her as such. It's just there was a lot of truth mixed in with a lot of lies. So it was really hard to determine what was true and what was not. I do genuinely believe that there were experiences in her sex work that were traumatic and there was definite sexual assault. I'm just not sure it was this person. However, in saying that, though, he had a criminal record and there was a conviction of an attempted sexual assault. But according to most people, he's actually trying to rebuild his life. His death was really brutal, though. He was shot multiple times and his car was found abandoned. His murder would later be used by Wernos' defense team to argue a pattern of self-defense. But for Richard's family, it's a really devastating loss. So again, I don't know if it's the accumulation of the trauma of what she had experienced in her sex work industry, and perhaps this had all come up, that's where this escalated, but I don't want to take away from the fact that Richard Mallory's family had said quite openly he was really trying to rebuild his life. So over the next year, 6 more men would die. We've got David Spears next. He's 43. He was a construction worker. He's described as gentle and really hardworking. He was actually found naked and shot 6 times. Then we've got Charles Kaskaden. He's 40, a rodeo worker from Missouri. He was traveling through Florida when he encountered her. He was shot 9 times. Then we've got Troy Burris. He's 50. He's a delivery driver for a sausage company. He was found later in the woods. Then we've got Charles Dick Humphreys. He's 56. He's a retired Air Force major, a former police chief, and a child abuse investigator. He was married and deeply loved by his family. His murder actually really shocked the community. He was shot multiple times as well and left in a remote location. Then we've got Walter Gino Antonio. He's a truck driver and a security guard. He's found nearly naked, shot 4 times. His car was missing. Then we've got Peter Sims. He is 65 years old. He's a retired merchant seaman. He's on a road trip. He's visiting relatives at the time, and his body was never found, but his car was found with her fingerprints inside of it. But I've got to say, each of these men, they had families, they had friends, they had lives. Their deaths, they're not just statistics and they're just not a story. They were ruptures in the lives of many people who loved them very, very dearly. Now, some of the families actually spoke out, expressing their heartbreak and their frustration and how the media focused on Eileen while their loved ones were just really reduced to footnotes. One of the victims actually said, "David was a gentle soul. He didn't deserve what happened to him." another one of the widows actually reflected, he spent his life protecting others. It's a cruel irony that his death was so violent. So, and this is where I don't want to say that Eileen lied, because I don't think that's a fair statement for me to make, because I don't know the full story. I would probably have to dig into hours and hours of confessions and read FBI reports and all those components. So I do say that I think these men potentially did not assault her. I think it's an accumulation of what had happened in her life, and it's almost like a snapping piece. And that's probably even more sad, because the people who potentially deserved her wrath and her rage and her violence potentially didn't actually receive it. So it's really quite sad that people who I think are true victims are not always spoken about, and are not those men are often just a side note in Eileen's story. And I think with the lies that she told, it's very hard to uncover the truth. So, but that's just my opinion, guys. That is solely my opinion. Her killing spree, though, lasted from December 1989 to November 1990. Her method was fairly consistent, though. She would meet the men while hitchhiking. Often she's posing as a sex worker. Then she would shoot them, and she would claim self-defense, and sometimes she wouldn't. The truth behind each encounter, it's never going to be fully known, though, guys. What is clear, though, is that 7 men lost their lives, and their stories deserve to be told, not just as victims of a serial killer, but as people who matter. So unfortunately, I don't have too much information on each of the victims, and I don't have too many photos. So you'll see in the background when I've been running my videos that there's not too many photos of people, which is really unfortunate, and I do apologize for that. So by late 1990, fears spreading across central Florida. Bodies of men were being discovered in remote wooded areas, each killed with a gun, often stripped of their belongings. They're left there without any type of explanation, and their victims had little in common, except one thing: they'd all been travelling alone, and they all encountered Eileen Wernos. Now, the investigation began with the discovery of Richard Mallory's abandoned car, followed by the bodies of David Spears and Charles. Now, law enforcement would notice a disturbing pattern. Each victim had been shot multiple times, and they were often found either naked or partially clothed, suggesting a possible sexual encounter before the murder. Detectives from multiple counties began to share information, realizing that they were potentially dealing with a serial offender. The turning point, though, came from Peter CM's car, was found in Orange Springs. Inside there, the fingerprints of Eileen Wuornos were found, and they were matched as part of a database check. Police began searching all of her movements. Witnesses had actually placed her with several of the victims. Now, surveillance footage and pawn shop records showed her selling items that would belong to those victims. She had started using aliases, and her identity was slowly being unraveled, though. The key to the case was her girlfriend, though, Tyria Moore. Now, investigators would approach her, and she would actually agree to cooperate in exchange for any type of immunity. So she was terrified. Her testimony would become the central part of the prosecution's case. In a series of recorded phone calls, Moore would urge her to actually confess, and she actually did. Her words were, "I did it. I'm the one who did it." She would claim self-defense, saying the men had tried to assault her, but evidence would often tell quite a different story. One was sort of more premeditation, robbery, and cold execution. The investigation was pretty meticulous, though. Ballistics linked the murders to the same weapon, a .22 caliber pistol. They would describe her as hitchhiking. She's often posing as a sex worker. Her fingerprints, the belongings, and confessions really, they ultimately sealed her fate and sealed the case. It's probably one of the very first instances, though, where they've identified a female serial killer in the United States. Now, for detectives, it wasn't about the headlines. It's all about justice for these victims and for the families. It's really about massive amounts of closure. And we've talked about this before on other podcasts, right? That I think that victims' families absolutely deserve a bucketload of closure and justice for themselves. In our next part of the podcast, we're going to explore the trial that followed and how the courtroom became a bit of a battleground for some of the truth, trauma, and accountability. Now, I'm just going to have a sip of my drink. Today, I am drinking Schweppes Blood and Orange Mango. Okay. She is very entertained. By 1981, The investigation of 7 murders across Florida had led to only one name, Aileen Wuornos. Now, with her arrest and her confession, the stage was set for one of the most watched trials in American criminal history. But behind a media frenzy was a courtroom filled with grief and anger and the pursuit of justice. She was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, and the trial began with Richard Mallory, the first known victim. Now, prosecutors would argue that Wernos had actually lured him under the guise of sex work and then shot him in cold blood. Her defense would claim no self-defense, citing about Mallory's criminal past. You remember that he was convicted of attempted sexual assault. But the prosecution, they actually presented some fairly compelling evidence, ballistics, fingerprints, and pawn shop records that would link Aileen to all of those items that were stolen from the victims. So the courtroom's quite tense. Family members of the victims would sit quite quietly. They're hoping for more answers. Tyria Moore, she's the former girlfriend. She took the stand. Her testimony was apparently really pivotal. She described their relationship. She would describe the behaviour, the phone calls where she would confess. So she had a lot of details of a lot of the murders. The prosecution painted a really, really big picture of premeditation, a pattern of targeting vulnerable men because they were always alone, robbing them and leaving them for dead. The defense tried to really humanize Aileen, pointing to her traumatic past, her health struggles, the claims of abuse, but the jury were unconvinced. I truly believe after watching some of the documentaries, there was a lot of trauma there. So I don't think I would ever deny that. I'm just not sure it was enough to cover off why you would kill 7 men. She did go into some quite explicit detail of what those men did to her. So again, I don't want to take that away from her. But on January 20, 1992, Aileen Wernos was found guilty of first-degree murder in the case of Richard Mallory. She was later convicted of 5 more cases and sentenced to death. The trial wasn't just about guilt, though. It's one of accountability for the families of the victims, and it was their chance to speak. So he spent his life protecting others. It's a cruel irony that he died so violently. Another family member actually shared, "We just wanted the truth. We just wanted to understand why." Her behaviour during the trial, though, Eileen's, was extremely erratic. At times she was really calm. At others she lashed out, accusing the court of corruption, betrayal. Her mental health was often questioned, and they actually ruled her competent to stand trial. I'm not sure in some cases. There was some pretty erratic behaviours, but was that just a play? So the trial of Aileen Wernos was a landmark case, not just because of the rare female serial killer, but it forced the public to confront some really harsh realities about what trauma, justice, and what goes on in the lives of shadows. So it exposed the underbelly of what trauma can do to a woman. After her conviction, though, Aileen Wernos was sentenced to death, and she was transferred to the Florida's Broward Correctional Institution. She would spend the next decade on death row. She's isolated, she's volatile, and she's extremely unstable during these times. It was more erratic behaviour, more emotional outbursts. She would accuse the prison staff of abusing her. She would say that she was being poisoned. She would often lash out at her legal team. Mental health professionals would end up diagnosing her with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Now, these are rooted in her traumatic past. So I'm not surprised at all that she was diagnosed with these. Despite all of her instability, she gave several interviews, and in her final years, she actually spoke to a lot of journalists, filmmakers, authors, and sometimes she was calm, sometimes she was really furious. Her most famous interview was with filmmaker Nick Broomfield, and he documented a lot of her shifting moods and deep paranoia. Some of the quotes from his documentary actually said, "Society's trash dumped on the side of the road." That's how she described herself. "I'm not a serial killer. I was raped. I killed in self-defense." So she would flip quite often between, "I'm really sorry for killing them," and then to say, "Oh, I know I killed them in self-defense." But her claims of self-defense are very contradicted by what she did afterwards. It's in her final days, though, that she seemed to really embrace what was about to happen. She declined any further appeals, and she actually requested to be executed. So on the 9th of October in 2002, she was executed by lethal injection, and her final words were chilling and cryptic. She actually said, "I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus, big spaceship and all, I'll be back." But her death really marked the end of a case that had captivated a lot of people, and it still captivates a lot of people because her legacy remains really complex. Some view her as a victim of abuse and neglect, a woman who's failed by the system that was meant to protect her. And often she's seen on the flip side of it as a cold-blooded killer who preyed on vulnerable men. For the families of the victims, it did bring some sort of closure or a measure of it. One of the family members actually said, "We didn't want revenge." Another one would say, "We wanted peace and we wanted our loved one remembered." So her stories, it's not just about crime. It's about trauma, it's about survival and the consequences of a life lived without love, safety and support. It's a real cautionary tale of what happens when pain goes unhealed, and really what type of justice comes with the humanity. Does it really exist? Because did she get justice and did those victims get justice? Her story, though, it's marked by violence, heartbreak and tragedy. Beneath the headlines and the courtroom drama, it lies a deeper conversation, one that's about justice and the trauma that shapes it. She was convicted in the end of murdering 7 men, and the legal system responded with swift and pretty decisive action. It was execution. So, but for many people, it did say, was it enough? Like, for me, did the death penalty really mark anything? Or should she have rotted in jail? Or should she have gotten the mental health that she needed? I'm hoping that for the families of the victims, it meant the chance to speak about their loved ones and names in the courtroom and see who the person that was responsible for their death to be held to accountable. But did she need to have mental health? And did she need to be in a hospital and get all of those things that, things like her childhood abuse, her neglect, her mental illness, her systematic failure to find her a safe place to land, basically, is the way that I'm trying to say it. Her actions were horrific. I'm never going to deny that. It was appalling what she did to those men. But you've sort of got to hold up a mirror and say, hang on, these are the consequences of what happens when you've got untreated trauma and the absence of any compassion. For a girl who by the age of 11 had been raped multiple times and had been physically assaulted. So I don't know if it's really it's not a clear-cut case for me. But then again, right, flip side of this, guys, I will talk about a male serial killer and the trauma that they go through and then be really mad at the way that they deal with it and by killing women. So even I am a walking contradiction. So it's not easy for me to say it's black and white, it's clear, all those things. I do think her story is a very sad story, and I think that it's really sad for the victims. But justice in this case, it's a courtroom verdict, and true justice, it's got to at least include some prevention, some support, and some reform. It must honour the victims, but while recognising the roots of that violence and where they stemmed from. It's got to be compassionate and firm. And it's got to be all these things. And I could probably sit there and go on and on about it. But I think that fundamentally, I think what she went through was just an unraveling amount of trauma that led to the death of 7 men. So thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Crimes from the Peanut Gallery. If you like this episode, please hit that like button. If you like this podcast, go and hit that subscribe. I would love to have some more viewers. I'd love to have some more subscribers. I absolutely love doing these podcasts, guys. You actually got to see a Charlotte for the majority of that podcast. So that was kind of awesome. I hope you have a fabulous weekend, my fellow peanuts. Until next time. See you later, guys. Bye. I'm done, babe.